Today, the backbench Labour MP in the UK House of Commons, Kim Leadbeater, introduced a bill to legalise what is called assisted dying. The Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill would make it possible, with important safeguards in place, for people who knew that they were imminently no longer for this world, who had only excruciating pain or abject conditions to expect in the meantime, to be helped to die with dignity. It's one of those difficult moral questions which invoke passionate and considered arguments on both sides. So let's discuss the issue and the likelihood that this bill will actually finally become law in the United Kingdom. The argument for the bill starts with the contention, as you would expect, that the status quo is not satisfactory. Right now, some UK citizens travel abroad, usually to Switzerland, to avail themselves of the ability to die peacefully under medical supervision. The fact that travel is required means that some people have felt the need to go earlier than they otherwise might have while they're still capable of that sort of travel. Particularly since if their partner or a relative helps them travel to that destination, they can be prosecuted. The bill's proponents argue that terminally ill people should have the personal autonomy to choose how and when they die, that this would help people to avoid extreme suffering, and they say forcing people to suffer for their last months is simply an act of legal cruelty. They also argue that the time has come where there is broad public support for the measure, something that has been backed by recent opinion polling. The arguments against the bill start with a sense that once you've created a system for killing people, the scope of how and why that gets offered may easily start to spread. Pressure could be put on vulnerable people, such as the elderly or disabled, to end their lives to avoid being a burden to their families. Whatever safeguards the law can create may simply not be adequate, they say, to protect against coercion or exploitation. And it could become in itself a slippery slope, where the eligibility criteria become wider over time, ultimately ending up in places the bill sponsors would never wish for. There's also the fact, they say, that often we hear of doctors' assessments of serious illness not always being totally accurate. I know people who have been told they only had months to live or a couple of years and yet then went on to still be in good shape even a decade later. So the possibility must be strong that some might make decisions on ending their lives based on a similarly faulty prognosis. There are plenty of places where assisted dying in some form or another is legal. In Europe, Spain and Austria were added to that list just in the last couple of years. It's been legal in Canada since 2016. It's legal in 11 of the states of the United States. In general, support for assisted dying has tended to remain strong in the places where it has already been legalised, although there are some places where there have been ongoing ethical debates, such as extending eligibility to people with mental illnesses. What just about all these places have sought to do is to ensure that there are strict safeguards in place. Generally, these involve multiple medical opinions, waiting periods, and mental competency assessments. Kim Leadbeater said that the lessons from those practical experiences have informed the detail of the bill that she presented today, and will likewise inform any agreed changes as it progresses. And a key distinction is whether the freedom is solely available for people suffering terminal illness, or whether it's available for people not imminently dying, but nevertheless unable to escape ongoing major suffering. The supporters of the measure argue that in those countries, which is the majority, where the distinction is only those suffering terminal illness, you see no slippery slope effect. It's a very binary choice. The danger comes if you widen the definition to ongoing suffering, because then you immediately get grey area questions. How much suffering is enough? How do you objectively draw any kind of line that makes sense between individuals? The UK bill, as testified by its very title, is clear that it is restricted to the terminally ill, so they argue it is not available to the slippery slope. Now that brings us to the question of whether the bill will actually become law. Firstly, it's worth noting one thing. I will agree with many that the UK political system has all sorts of weaknesses and frustrations, but I do think that our approach to these sorts of moral questions is one of the best. Moral questions that have included in the past the sorts of minefields that have lit up political conflict in other countries, such as abortion and the death penalty. In the UK, these sorts of debates are kept strictly non-party political. None of the major political parties is taking a specific line on this bill, recognising there are strong feelings on both sides and that the question isn't inherently one of ideology. As a result, the vote today on the bill's second reading was a free vote. The vote on its final reading, which would see the bill become law if it was passed, would be likewise. No party whips, all MPs free to vote with their conscience. This has served the country extremely well in the past. Whereas, for instance, the United States has been regularly torn apart by political parties seizing on such deeply moral issues because they become ways to mobilise their base, and so they politicised them over the decades. The UK has largely settled those questions, and once settled, they tend to stay settled, regardless of changes of government. Unless and until, of course, social attitudes in the country have evolved so much that everyone recognises it's time to go back and review an issue once again. And that's arguably where we are with this question. The mechanism for this bears explaining because it's important to working out its chance of success. Every year, there is a ballot of all backbench members of Parliament. The top 20 in the ballot are given the opportunity to introduce a parliamentary bill, what's called a private member's bill. So, for example, the 1967 Abortion Act was a private member's bill introduced by the Liberal MP David Steele. Realistically, you have to be at least in the top 10 to have a fair chance of getting enough parliamentary time to get your bill into law. Since they are not government bills, they're not guaranteed sufficient time. And this is somewhat exacerbated by the fact that private members' bills are debated on Fridays, when many MPs have gone back to carry out duties in their constituencies. Now that matters, because it's possible to filibuster a bill on the floor of the House, for MPs who are opposed to it to simply make lengthy speeches until it runs out of time. To prevent that, you need to have 100 MPs in the chamber, who can then force a vote that the question now be put, that it now be voted on. For many bills, getting 100 MPs into Parliament on a Friday is an ask too far, so they are unable to prevent their bill from being talked out should somebody want to do that. It's been a real issue, because there are certain, usually Conservative MPs, who thoroughly dislike the private members' bill system, which they feel enables bills to get passed without sufficient scrutiny. So they just routinely object and seek to bring down bills using that mechanism. But in this case, on a question this big, this high profile, obviously way more than 100 MPs were always going to be present for this debate. And given the nature of the bill, any individual MP who was foolish enough to try to filibuster it would get a major backlash amongst MPs widely and ongoing. Now, this isn't the first time the question has been debated, so you might presume that whatever happened last time should have just happened again this time. After all, no fewer than 5 private members' bills attempted to overturn the Abortion Act over the 3 subsequent decades after it was passed. They all failed. But in this case, it was different. It was almost a decade since the last time a vote was held on this issue. On that occasion, it was a huge vote against the proposition. 329 opposed to the bill, just 117 in favour. Since then, you might have noticed, there's been a landslide election where the Conservative representation was completely savaged, and a whole bunch of new, often younger, mostly Labour MPs with no track record for us to go by entered. So, right up to the vote today, it was very much an open question which way this new cohort of MPs would go, although there was a strong suspicion that they would be much more open to agreeing the measure. And so it turned out. After a respectful but passionate debate, Parliament at its very best, at least the parts I had time to watch, the bill passed its second reading. So what happens next? It now goes to committee for detailed consideration. For a bill of this magnitude, this may include the opportunity for outside groups to submit evidence. That's not usually done for private members' bills, but there is flexibility to allow it, which would likely, or at least is possible to be exercised here. Then you get to the report stage, which is the real big moment, the third reading. The bill returns to the House of Commons main chamber. Opponents can propose amendments, and they may still be able to seek to run the bill out of time by doing so, but that has become rarer in recent years, and again, don't think it would go down well. If it's considered to be a key moral question, the government might step in and offer to provide extra time for the bill so that it reaches a final vote one way or the other. This has happened in the past with private members' bills on abortion, homosexuality legalisation, and the death penalty specifically. That was done. And indeed, before the election, now Prime Minister Keir Starmer promised to allow parliamentary time for the issue if it turned out to be needed. So there is still a lot of ground to cover before we finally get to that end point, which will probably be around April next year. It's important to note, just because the vote went in favour for the second reading does not mean it's guaranteed to do so for the final reading, because often the votes on second reading are more votes on the broad principle of a measure, but a bill may fall on the third due to concerns with the detail of implementation contained within the draft of the bill. So it ain't over till it's over. In the meantime, what's your take on the issue? If you've been in the House of Commons today, how would you have cast your vote? Let me know in the comments below.